Okay, I hope you can all see my Maestro. I'm going to be talking, yes, about advanced selection techniques because, of course, selection is very important in Maestro 11. And so first, and perhaps most important, is very simple tip that you can double-click to expand your selection up to the next level. We did mention this before, but I just want to reiterate because a lot of our users switch frequently between atom picking mode and residue picking. And there are shortcuts for that, A and R, but you don't really need to do that most of the time now because if you are picking an atom and then you decide you want the whole residue or small molecule, you can just double click. And this works, as I said, on the residue, on the small molecule, waters, etc. Now, if you triple click, you're going to go up to the next level, which depending on the structure, let's go to this structure because it has separate chains that are separate molecules. So if you triple click, you now have just one of the chains, as you can see. Sorry, I just messed it up. In the structure hierarchy. Let me get this going again. There we go. Now we have chain A. And if I triple click down here, 1, 2, 3. I'm having trouble triple clicking today. Let's do this again. All right, well, that's good enough anyway. You saw it once. There, that's chain A likes it. So that's how you can triple click. Now, if I were in residue mode, I could just double click to get the chain. 1 click is the residue, and 2 clicks is the chain. Again here. So that's one tip. And it works, the double clicking works with other modifiers. So for instance, if I double click my residue and I want to, I don't know why all of a sudden I'm having problems here. If I want to double click another residue and keep them both selected, I can shift double click and that still works. So shift double click. And if I am in subtractive picking, I can double click to deselect. So basically, all the modifiers work with the double clicking. So that can really speed your actions. You don't have to keep changing your residue mode. And another reason to stay in atom picking mode is that we've introduced bond picking to atom picking mode. So when you are in atom picking mode, you can choose a bond by just clicking between the 2 atoms. And you can't do that in the higher level modes. Okay, another thing I wanted to go over is that you can clear selection. Okay, so let me step back. Everyone knows you can do a marquee like that to select atoms, right? And if you do a shift and with the marquee, you're adding to your selection. But here's a trick. How do you remove from your selection? Obviously, you can control marquee, but since controlling actually is actually doing a toggle, you could end up accidentally, like I just did here, reselecting that you just tried to deselect. And you see it's not really working. But if you go into the subtractive picking, now you don't have to hold down any modifier keys and you can deselect and you don't have to worry about accidentally reselecting anything. I'm going to show you a case where that's really very useful, and it's another kind of a separate tip, which is suppose you've created a binding site surface. So I'm going to say binding site, and I'm going to say quick surface. Now, if you look at this surface, it has a very nice pocket, but it also has some kind of debris out here that you probably didn't want in your surface, if you're going to, especially if you're going to take a screenshot, use it in a presentation. So you can go into subtractive picking mode. Now, in this case, you could double click this to get rid of that whole residue. It doesn't look that useful. But some of these others, you might just want to marquee across the area where the surface is and clean up a little bit of this surface without potentially adding to the selection by using your control character. Now, if I now hide this surface and I create another one, you can see that this surface is a lot cleaner, and I could go and iterate on this and keep doing this. And once I've done it repeatedly until I get it just right, I can go here and delete any extra surfaces. So that's just a little useful trick for making prettier surfaces. Now suppose I have decided that, oh no, this is a really nice selection that I did. Oh, I should show you, you know why you have these ragged edges here? Well, marqueing actually only works on visible atoms. So one thing you might need to do, because my hydrogens were hidden, is make sure that all your selected atoms are visible. And once you do that, you can marquee more effectively. I'll just do this one more time to show you what I mean. So I've just hidden some more atoms. I've just deselected some more atoms. And now you can see my surface looks a bit better. So say I'm happy with this surface, and I want to save the selection for later use. There's a few ways to do it. I'm going to show you the quick way. If I type Control-1, or if you're on a Mac, it's Command-1, I'm actually saving that selection in the number 1. Control-2, it would save it in the number 2. This is actually available here in the Select menu under Save Selection. There's the shortcut. But now watch, if I've just done this, and now I can type 1 and get my selection back. Okay, I'll do it again so you can see. There's my selection. Now this only lasts for this session, but it could be useful if you want to reuse it. And I'll show you a way to save it more permanently in a little bit. So we've talked about advanced techniques for picking. Now we can look at using advanced techniques with the quick select objects. And I think we've talked already about this, but I'm going to go over it again. So for instance, if you say you wanted to select your binding site, your ligand, and all your waters in order to style them a certain way. So you can say binding site and ligand here, that's easy. But how would you add waters? Well, you say plus. You're in the add mode here. And then you say waters. And now you've got, so you can see some waters here. And suppose we just make them all ball and stick. Now you decide, ooh, that ball and stick on the protein is a little much. So I'm going to change my protein to thin tube. So I'll just subtract the ligand and the solvents at this point and make that thin tube. And now when I'm done with the special picking, I can just click this remove button and get out of the special picking. So I've done that, and now let's say, well, actually I see these waters all around. I only really want to see the waters in the binding site. So how would I do that? Well, I could select all my waters and remove the waters in the binding site by saying remove the binding site. And now I can hide those waters, and I've only hidden the waters in the binding site. And then one final example. Now I have my hydrogens showing on my waters, but they look a little heavy. Maybe I want to make those thin too, but just the hydrogens, not the whole water. So how would I do that? So first, let me select my waters. And then I'm going to remove the oxygens from my selection, which in this case is heavy atoms. So now I can style just the hydrogens with thin tube. So you can see how building up kind of complex selections using the add and remove and this common objects is really useful. Now this kind of thing used to be done using the atom selection dialog, and we still do have the atom selection dialog. And that's here under the define button. But now, of course, you don't need to use it so much for that. I'm going to show you some other things you might want to use it for, however. So I just selected the binding site residues. And if you open the atom selection dialog, and you want to, for instance, suppose you wanted to know which atoms are in the binding site residues. What are the atom numbers? Perhaps you're going to use that information in another panel or send it to another user so that they can do their selection. So if you click this selection button, you will load the current workspace selection into this dialog so that you can look at it or modify it. So this lists all the atom numbers. They're showing ranges, but and you can see there's 466 of them. If you wanted to see every single atom number, you could click atom number and they're all listed out. And if you wanted to see them by residue number, you can click residue number. And if you see there's 30, in the status bar, it tells you there are 32 residues, and here are the 32 residues. I'm going to go to another example that's a little easier to see. I'm going to go into one chain molecule, because one thing to keep in mind, if you're using residue numbers in a multi-chain structure, you might end up, you need to qualify it by the chain, because otherwise you'll end up picking the same residue numbers in all your chains, and I can show you how to avoid that. So here we have a much smaller binding site. It's only 8 residues, as you can see down in the status bar. So if I did that, and suppose just to be safe, I mean, as I know, this is only chain A, but if I wanted to be safe and make sure that I was only picking these residues out of chain A, I could qualify it and say that the selection has to be these residue numbers intersected with chain A. So that is, it has to be, both statements have to be true. So that's one way to qualify your selections here. Now the dialog here gives you a lot of options. You can select by element, by whether something's in the backbone or not. You can pick a residue number. You can pick a residue type. So for instance, if I wanted to exclude any lysines, I could say subtract the lysine. And now if I click OK, I only have 5 residues selected instead of 8. So this is the kind of thing you can do with the ASD. And I wanted to show you one other cool thing, because you can build up very complicated, I'll go back here. You can build up very complicated selections and then save those selections as your own special set that is going to be available in this special objects menu you see down here. So let's do one. For instance, you want to say it's got to be in chain A, and it has to be in the backbone. So it's got to be both in chain A and a backbone, and you don't want the hydrogens. So you can eliminate the hydrogens by saying subtract. So that's a useful selection. So you can create a set for that and call that chain A backbone, no H, okay? And now I can use that if well, let's make sure it was created, there we go. And if we say create chain A backbone, no H, it's here. And you could go to a different structure and use it, because that's a general purpose concept. Now, I guess I'd already made these, so I'm sorry. But you could also take that stored set of selected atoms that I stored before under selection 1. Say you decided that's actually really useful and I want to save it even when I'm, close Maestro and come back to it. So I had that selection 1 that I saved. If I went into here and I loaded that selection, I can create a set from that as well. So that becomes permanent, and that's what I did here. You'll see I have the binding site for the surface. And I can prove it by making another pretty surface. There we go. Okay. So I know I went kind of fast, but I just wanted you to know that the ASD has all this functionality for picking very specific sets of atoms, and then you can even save them and have them accessible here, and that gets stored as part of your project, and there is a manage window that lets you manage them. Okay, so there's just a few more things I want to go over with selection. One of them is expanding your selection. A lot of you probably know that it's very common to want to grab some of the residues around your ligand, but maybe our default binding site is maybe too big for you and you wanted a smaller set. So you can just select the ligand and then go to expand and pick the radius you want, say, only 3 angstroms. If you had, and it's set to automatically expand to the full residue, but if you didn't want that, if you literally only wanted the atoms within 3 angstroms, you could do that by unchecking this before you pick a radius. And if you wanted to not have the ligand selected, you just want the ring around the ligand, you can, before you pick the radius, you can check this unselect selected atoms. And one last thing in this menu I want to show you is that you can also match by a variety of types. If you've found a particular, say you have this glutamic acid residue and you want to select all the glutamic acid residues, you could go into the dialog I showed you, but you could also just say same residue type, and that automatically selects all of them. And similarly, if you can do it for a particular representation. So here I have, I've styled certain things with tube, thin tube, both these residues and these hydrogens. And suppose I want to put them back to regular wireframe. I can select one atom of thin tube and then say expand matching items, same representation. And now I've selected everything that's thin tube, and I could put it back to wireframe if I wanted, or make it thick tube, which looks really nasty. And similarly for color, if I had styled, to highlight certain residues, I'd made them pink. I could pick one pink atom and change the color on all, and say expand by color, and then expand by color would pick everything of the same color. In this case, I got a hydrogen, so it's everything that's either red or white. Okay. And then my last tip for selection is ribbons. Okay. So some people like to work with no atoms visible in the workspace, or maybe just the ligand and none of the protein atoms. And occasionally, though, they might want to see something or do something with one of the residues. And right now, if you have the ribbon here, you can actually click on the ribbon and select the alpha carbon for that residue. And you can build up a selection by, with shift click and so forth, and use the additive and subtractive picking and so on. And once you do that, you see it says I have 4 atoms, 4 residues selected. And I can use this to, for instance, delete the ribbon. I can also choose to display the backbone using the palette, which Robert will be showing you later, and so on. So individual atoms, it's the CA, so it's useful, but it might be more useful to go into residue picking mode, because when you're in residue picking mode, you can actually see, when you hover, the entire residue. And that gives you a lot of information. And when you click, of course, you're clicking the entire residue. So you can go ahead and select all along the chain, all along the ribbon that way. And when you're in residue picking or higher, if you double click, it goes up. The atom picking will be working in the next release. So then you won't have to go into residue picking, except if you want to see this preview, which is very nice. So that is what I wanted to show you about selection, and I think I'm going to pass the presentership over to Robert now.
Actually, Laura, you can keep presenting. I'll just talk. We can demo with yours.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
Easier. Thanks for that. So the first tip I want to talk about is related to automatically changing the view when changing entries. So we briefly talked about this during the Select Toolbar talk. But we take a look at it again a little more in depth as Laura sets up the workspace, since she's anticipating what I'm about to talk about. So there's a fit button up in the top middle of the Select toolbar, and then below that there are 3 buttons. So the first one is fitting to the whole workspace, and that'll zoom out and put any visible atom in view. And then to the right of that, with the little box around the arrow, is zooming just to your selection, so it fits, when you click that, it'll fit right to whatever you selected. And then the L within the little box will zoom right to the ligand, regardless of where your selection is. So the neat trick that we wanted to demo today is that above it, there's this little auto button. And when that turns on, you can also see a little ligand button next to it, and we'll show you what that is in a second. But this will allow the view to automatically change when you're switching through entries. So now that we are changing among various 1FJS or Core TVG, you'll notice that the screen will reset. So Laura, why don't you turn it off for a second, maybe zoom in somewhere weird so we could see. So now that auto's off, we're going to keep the camera in the same place, no matter the entry you're in. And this is useful if you're, for example, looking at docking poses, because you have similar structure, but as you can see, Laura just clicked on an entry which has a camera view on something that doesn't exist. So for very disparate structures, the auto button is not useful. I mean, turning on auto is not useful, or is useful. But when you have similar structures, you don't want to have the auto button on because then you're keeping the same view and you can, for example, just swipe through the ligand. So if we want to change the view to show all displayed atoms, you turn on the auto button. And then also we have, once that's on, the ligand button becomes visible. And when that's also turned on, not only do you refit the view to the structure, but you refit it just to the ligand. So those disparate structures still work now here because it'll just view to a different part of the ligand. So that's another way also through viewing docking poses, since you'll probably be looking at the ligand, you can keep auto ligand on. It'll slightly change your view, but it'll always go to whatever ligand is within the structure. So the second tip is also about controlling the view. It's a little different than just the fit button, but what we want to do is be able to control the global camera view with just one mouse button, which often comes in handy when you're in the middle of doing something else, or perhaps you're on a laptop and just want to quickly rotate without having to find a mouse or having to change your mouse controls. So when Laura clicks on the spacebar, you'll see that there's this little camera transformation heads-up display. And it says left-click and drag on an icon to enter the viewing transformation. And you can just left-click over the rotate or the translate or the zoom, and then you're just using one mouse button to be able basically to control all three mouse buttons, but just one at a time. And you can do this at any time, but it's particularly valuable when you're already editing. So Laura can show us kind of in conjunction with the builder. So if you're in the new Move Atoms mode and doing a dihedral rotation, your mouse gets taken over by the editing controls, and you're kind of in this editing and build mode. But what you might want to do, say you can't see something, or you want a different angle, you want to be able to change the entire camera view without losing what you're doing. So you can hold down the space bar and then be able to drag and move around and kind of reframe your view. And then when you let go of the space bar, you're still in the previous editing mode. So you don't have to keep going in and out of editing view. You can just hit the space bar and be able to switch between controlling the camera or controlling the actual selection of the structure. So the next part has to do with right-clicking on auxiliary features that are in the workspace. So we'll just create a demo surface, or maybe you can just pull up one of the surfaces you already created. And you can make sure that when your mouse is over an area of the surface that has no visible atoms or ribbons underneath it, that you'll notice the cursor will change just to that regular black cursor, and next release will have kind of a surface little icon to replace the A. And if you're having trouble getting this cursor to show up, just make sure that anything in your way, atoms or ribbons, are kind of hidden or out of the view so you can actually get access to be able to right-click right on the structure. So once you have the little black cursor on the structure, you can right-click, and then you can do things like change the appearance. So we can open up display options here, and now you can change the style, and on the fly, you'll be able to preview it and update, say you want a mesh representation or dot, or you want to change the front or back transparency, or the color, or even rename it. This is kind of a quick way to rename the surface, which will show up in your surface table, something perhaps more descriptive. And there's a couple other objects in that menu too. So now you can see when you go over to click on the S in the entry list, so you'll have your new name. And within the right-click menu, there's also the ability to hide a surface or delete it. And then you can also get back to it through the S panel, or you can pop up the Manage Surfaces panel to manage all the surfaces from all your entries. And that might bring up a familiar tool. So generally, what we want to do is be able to make all objects in the workspace kind of right-clickable. So you want to be able just to click on things and show and hide and modify them. And so Laura briefly showed that you can do that with ribbons before. We just talked about surfaces. We could look at ribbons a little more. So if we add some ribbons, we can clear the selection. If we have no selection and right-click the ribbon, it'll implicitly select all the ribbons. So now we can change the coloring or the style from cartoon to form, curved line. And you can just kind of update this on the fly through that little editing ribbon tool. And if you have just a particular set of residues selected, ribbon selected, then right-clicking only will affect those. So if you want to change those to green, for example, or delete them, you can basically just build up substructures of the ribbon, right-click, change particular colors as needed. And if we want to hide all the atoms that are associated with ribbons, there's a in the palette down at the bottom is display atoms, and we can kind of toggle between the backbone, turning that on and off, the atoms associated with any ribbons or the side chains. So that's a quick way to be able to modify the ribbons or address anything related to the atoms with the ribbons. So say you have the ribbons you like, if you want to hide everything, you might just right-click and then undisplay the associated atoms. So we've talked about ribbons and surfaces. Now let's make a measurement. We can see how we can play with those. So measure is one of the default favorites. So you can click measure on the favorites bar. It'll pop up this little banner, and now Laura can select sequentially 2 atoms and makes a distance. Now you'll also notice that there's a little label that shows you the distance itself. And you can adjust the position of the measurement labels by right-clicking and go to Move Measures. And now you can just drag them around your workspace, perhaps on the way, or you want to set up a screenshot. And if you want to discard them, you can click Cancel or Escape, or if you want to accept them, you can click OK. And so Laura there clicked Escape, so that'll reset the position. Another way of doing that is you can right-click after dragging it around and then click on Reset Position. And that'll put it back to the starting place. So you can always keep it, take a picture, and then be able to reset it to how it was before. So something really neat is now that once you've measured a distance or an angle, you might decide to change it. So if you go on the Adjust Distance option in this menu, you'll be able to see this banner that allows you to adjust the atom distance, and then you can drag with your left mouse button to kind of move around and expand the distance as Laura's doing. And if you had a particular distance in mind, you can right-click and go to Set Distance, and then you can just type in directly the value you were looking for, click Enter, and it will automatically put it at that position. And in certain areas or certain situations, we do have default distances and angles for particular known structures. So this is kind of an arbitrary selection. And the last thing we want to talk about is modifying the workspace properties. So Laura has this hidden in her workspace right now, but in the top left, you can see that she'll hover over the area and it'll give you this little title. And she can click on that once, and that will make it visible. And then you can also click on it again to be able to quickly add properties from your project table or remove or reorder them, and it will always be visible in the workspace. This is really useful if you have a property, a valuable property across entries you want to scroll through, and you'll just be able to see the structure and then also see that particular value of the property visible in the title. And you can always right-click that to be able to hide it. And one other way to turn on and off the workspace properties is down in the bottom right corner in the workspace configuration. There's the little plus, and that has the workspace properties toggle, and that turn on and off as well, but it's nice to be able just to edit directly in the workspace. And if you have it off, you can always kind of preview it in that faded text. If you don't want it kind of cluttering up your screen, but you still want to be able to find information about it on the fly. And on that note, let me hand it back to Laura to show us a little building and superposition.
Okay. I should show you one thing that I didn't do the right thing for Robert to show you, which is if you have something that's measured like a bond that has a specific value, if I can find, let me hide my ribbons for a second. You can, if you click on that label, well, I'm having too much trouble catching it here. Here we go. There you go. And when you say set length, it'll actually have an option to set the optimal value. Since it's a bond, we know what that is. It'll adjust it for you. Okay. Moving right along. So my last bit is to show you a little bit about building with overlaid structures. So some of our users like to do a lot of 3D building, and often they are doing, they're working with ligands that are largely the same, but they want to build them out and then take them in different directions. And so here I have 4 ligands, 2 of which, 2 pairs of identical ligands and slightly different at one end. And let's just, and they're just something useful. I have them colored by entry carbon, so that is by entry, so that you can sort of see the difference. So I'm going to show you how to build using overlaid structures. It saves you a whole lot of time rather than having to build individually. So the basic trick is to always use marquee selection. Always go like this when you select, because it looks like I only selected one atom, but because I did marquee and everything is visible, remember everything has to be visible to marquee, when I marquee over that, it says down here on the status bar that I have 4 atoms, 4 residues. So I have 1 atom selected from each residue. So now if I wanted to do something like, oh, I don't know, add a methyl group here, I could do that. I've selected, 1 atom on each residue, and when I add the methyl group, I've actually added it to all the groups, which you could kind of see here, to all the ligands, which you could kind of see here, but I'll show you how you can verify this, which is we have the new fragment menu, and if you select the fragment that was added, you'll see now you have 16 atoms on 4 residues. So we added that methyl to all the residues at one time. That's much more efficient than having to add them separately. And you can not only add fragments this way, but you can change elements. You can do pretty much all the basic editing. So here again, I have this 1 atom selected, and suppose I wanted to change it to a nitrogen on all of them at one time. Again, I've done that because I have all 4 atoms selected at one time. I know that's not very chemically sound, so I will put it back. I could also select, if I select both atoms, I can now take bond actions on this bond, so I could increase the bond order here. And again, that's going to take effect on all of the structures at once, which I could show you by stepping, making each one invisible, and you'll see that I've done the same thing on all of them. So that's a useful trick for changing multiple structures at one time, and it works, as I said, for you can delete, you can change bond order, you can change element, you can do almost everything in this row except the add bond, because add bond requires exactly 2 atoms to be selected. You could do it for add hydrogen, but minimize doesn't really work very well when you have overlaid structures. And as an aside, because you only operate on the visible because you can only marquee visible atoms, one trick, if you say I wanted to add another methyl group but only to 2 of the 4 structures, I can just make 2 of the 4 structures invisible right now. Now right now they're all 4 residues are selected, but if I redo that selection now, I only have 2 residues selected because I made the other 2 invisible before I made the selection. And now if I wanted to add another methyl group, I'm only adding it, as you can see here, to 2 of the residues. And I can do something, if I want to do something different with these 2, for instance, I could add the methyl here instead. So that's just a quick tour of how you can work with multiple structures simultaneously. And I think that wraps it up for today.